ABC Listen. Podcasts, radio, news, music and more.
Hi, Patricia Carvelis here from the new podcast Politics Now. And as the federal election campaign kicks off, I'm joined by the ABC's sharpest political minds, like Claudia Long.
That's the implication, right?
Of
You're
course.
so right. It's about are people just sitting at home on their butts, basically, not doing very much and getting paid a great deal?
To break down the biggest news stories of the day, it's called Politics Now, and you can find it on the ABC Listen app.
The power of the unions. It's always been a huge battleground for Labor and the Coalition. Now there are revelations about the role the former Prime Minister, John Howard, and his ministers really played in one of the biggest, most divisive industrial disputes in Australia's history. Today, Fran, host of the podcast series Conspiracy, War on the Waterfront, on what was hidden from the public until now. I'm Sam Hawley on Gadigal land in Sydney. This is ABC News Daily.
Another day, another dispute. The decision by over 300 of Patrick's wharfies to stop work for yet another 48 hours at the East Swansea.
The union's now totally out of control and is causing irreparable damage to the Victorian and the Australian economies.
Would John Howard be prepared to use mercenaries to break union power on the wharves?
What an extraordinary question. I'm in favour of everything that's strictly in accordance with the laws of Australia.
Patrick Stevedores has announced the sacking of its entire workforce around the country. Security guards moved on to dock sites in several cities, locking out Patrick's 1,400 workers.
How's your family and kids going? Eh? How's your family and kids going?
The confrontation at Melbourne's East Swansea dock in the dead of night, where workers battle to stop private security guards.
The announcement last night of the dismissal, the sacking of 1,400 workers was made by none other than the Minister, Peter Reid.
Jan, the Waterfront dispute, for those of us, of course, who can remember it, it was one of the most bitter and controversial industrial disputes in our history, wasn't it?
Indeed it was. It was a dispute between Patrick Stevedores, and stevedores are the folks that load and unload containers from ships, the federal government, so that was the Howard government at the time, and the Maritime Union of Australia, the MUA. And the dispute revolved around Chris Corrigan, who was the managing director of Patrick's, wanting to sack a 1,400-strong union workforce and replace them with an alternative non-union workforce, essentially to break the hold that the MUA had over the wharves.
All right, so it all comes to a head on April the 8th, 1998, when thousands of these workers, they're known as wharfies, they're locked out of the docks.
I mean, this was a watershed moment.
Yeah.
On the evening of the 7th of April 1998, security guards with balaclavas brought dogs onto wharves right around the country. This is Patrick's wharves, so we're talking Fremantle, Darling Harbour, East Swansea, Port Botany up in Sydney, and effectively kicked workers out of their workplace, and they were told not to come back.
Angry waterside workers being evicted from Patrick's terminals as the company carries out mass sackings around the country overnight.
You low blood, hundreds of bloke out of work. How do you feel? How do you feel, you dirty low blooders?
Basically what was happening was that Patrick Stevedores had sacked all of its workers, 1,400 workers.
1,400 workers, exactly, because, Chris Corrigan, who, as I said, MD of Patrick's, he was in a bit of a spot. Patrick's share price was tanking. He thought productivity on the wharves was incredibly low, and he blamed the wharfies.
Cargo has to move. We've got strikes every other day. We've got to bring this thing to an end.
And it's important to note that every worker, There may have been a few here and there, but every worker on the dock at the time was a member of the Maritime Union of Australia. That's the MUA, which is quite a militant trade union. And what I mean when I say that is that it was quite an active trade union. If it didn't like something, it would strike. So the lockout led to these extremely intense days and days, and if not weeks, of extremely intense protests on picket lines.
1,400 workers with their wives and children were the sacrificial lamb. You will not be forgotten.
It was a really, really strong display of civil disobedience.
Wow. Okay, and of course it's important to remember that, as you said, John Howard was Prime Minister at that time. He'd just been elected and he'd made absolutely no secret of the fact that he wanted to reform the waterfront.
We spoke to Howard. We interviewed him for this series, and he describes himself as a dog with a bone about this issue.
The waterfront had to be at our sites because it was notoriously inefficient. I mean, if you were interested in industrial relations, you knew that the Australian waterfront was notorious.
All right, so there's these 1,400 workers. They're all locked out of the docks. There's these massive strikes and protests, incredible scenes. And Jan, that's because months before, behind the scenes, the head of Patrick Stevedores, Chris Corrigan, as you mentioned, has been working to basically replace them all. What's he been up to?
Yeah, so there's months that lead up to this crescendo, which happened in April 1998. The wharfies, as we said, are prone to striking. It's a massive problem for the companies in Chris Corrigan's eyes, and he comes up with this plan that he wants to create this new workforce, one that is not unionised. And what they do is they put advertisements, job advertisements, in the Army magazine because they're looking to recruit specifically ex-Army personnel, ex-service members. And the training that they intend to do with these ex-service members is going to happen in Dubai. That was the plan. They wanted to get them these sort of international shipping qualifications. It was all very hush-hush, all very secret. Even the people that they recruited weren't told much about the job that they were applying for. I mean, we spoke to one man, Mark, who was a retiring soldier at the time in 97, and he came across this job ad and he said to us, you know, it was just so strange how quickly everything kind of happened.
I had an impression that the government was involved when that passport went through within 2 hours. I thought, wow, whoever gets issued a passport within 2 hours? Someone within the Commonwealth had to give that authority for a passport to be issued, and that's when my suspicions started.
So, Jan, the government is accused of being involved in Corrigan's plan to replace the dock workforce with these non-union workers that would be trained up in Dubai. And then all this comes to a really dramatic moment on the floor of the federal parliament. Tell me about that.
That's right. So we're in December 1997. Kim Beazley and Lindsay Tanner basically start lobbing questions at the government in question time.
What knowledge do you have of this covert operation to recruit a force of industrial mercenaries from the ranks of the military? And when did you first become aware of it?
I'm not aware of it at all.
Peter Reith, who was the Workplace Relations Minister at the time, and the government denied being involved at all.
Mr Speaker, I must say I don't know any of those names of either the companies or the individuals that the member has asked me of, so the answer is no.
And Reith denied it right up until his death. And look, training a workforce overseas or training a workforce here is not illegal. What is illegal, so the illegal aspect of it, and this was according to the MUA's lawyers, you couldn't be sacked for being in a union. And at this point, a legal challenge was mounted, accusing the government of an unlawful conspiracy to sack the workforce. What happened is that after months of negotiating, there was a return to work deal that was struck between the MUA and Patrick's, and the union decided to drop that conspiracy case. So it's never fully been tested in court. And the agreement eventually saw half of the unionised workforce made redundant, and the remaining workers have, you know, depends on who you speak to, either more or less control over when and how they worked.
Jan, the government is denying any knowledge of this secret workforce being trained in Dubai. But all these years later, well, you've done a fair bit of work on it and you've unearthed a lot more, that the Howard government may have had more knowledge than it let on.
Yeah, so until now, no senior member of Cabinet at the time has admitted knowing about the Dubai training exercise before the public found out about it. But we spoke with former Howard Minister John Sharp, and he told us that back in 1997, this is well before the lockout, well before anyone had gotten on a plane to Dubai, that he attended a meeting in Peter Reith's office in Melbourne.
That I attended with the NFF and Chris Corrigan, and they came forward with this plan to train an alternative workforce, to do it in Dubai, and to then have them available to step in the instance of a dispute where they could take over the running of the operation.
Now, we know from other bits of evidence that Peter Reith was at that meeting, and he claimed that he didn't even know that Dubai had a port.
I don't think I even knew Dubai was a port, Shocking ignorance, I suppose.
Whereas John Sharp, who attended the same meeting, came out of that meeting knowing all sorts of things about how efficient the port in Dubai was. So there's this real inconsistency between two Howard ministers at the time.
Okay, and you've also established more. You've been speaking to the historian Geraldine Feller. What does she reveal to you about what was going on at the time? She's gone deep, deep, deep into the archives, hasn't she?
She has indeed, really digging away in those archives.
I've been looking at Peter Reith's diaries and papers from the time. Not many people have looked at these.
And she's uncovered scribbled notes and entries and excerpts from secret reports, really quite top secret reports that a lot of reporters and journalists at the time had trouble finding, which show that Peter Reith was all over the planning and the execution and the outcomes of these reforms, that he was, in a sense, leading the strategy, not just monitoring from the sideline.
Importantly, there's a specific mention of an overseas training plan. A plan to train an alternative non-union workforce offshore. It even says the location is chosen. It also talks about a company restructure having taken place. And by the way, this report, we know it went to Peter Reith in early October.
You know, the diaries speak not just to the plans involved in that kind of timeline, but also to the attitude and I think the mindset that the government had about the workers on the docks.
And Reith finally gets the numbers about how many wharfies will be made redundant. He scrawls in his diary, 700 bludgers weeded out.
And he used that word, bludgers.
He did.
Right.
So, tell me then, what about the Prime Minister? What have you uncovered about what John Howard did or didn't know at the time?
Well, look, John Howard has always maintained that he did not know of Corrigan's plan to train Australians in Dubai or indeed to train Australians offshore. Now, we found one more document in a correspondence file at the National Archives of Australia. We found a letter. This is dated from September 1997. So this is, again, well before the lockout, before anyone gets on a plane to Dubai. It's a letter from John Howard's Chief of Staff, Arthur Sinodinos, to John Howard. And in it, it kind of outlines the state of play of waterfront reform, and it outlines the strategy that we all know then plays out in the first quarter of 1998. And it talks specifically about reactivating the training of Australians offshore.
What we see here is that the Prime Minister was actually intricately involved, intricately aware, and to an extent directing the plans for reform and in this case, the training of Australians offshore.
Now, John Howard's always denied knowing anything about offshore training, and yet here in this letter is that word offshore. And we put this information to John Howard. We asked him this question specifically about the letter, and he came back to us confirming that he had read the letter, but said that he had nothing further to add than what he'd already told us.
All right. So, Jan, these new pieces of information that you've uncovered potentially implicate the Howard government more than we previously thought. And it matters, right, because this whole saga, it really did change the landscape when it comes to industrial disputes.
Yeah, it matters hugely because the waterfront dispute, it was never just about the waterfront. It was always about power, and about power clashing and shifting in this extraordinarily cataclysmic way. And also about, holding leaders and governments to account.
Jan Fran is the host of the podcast series Conspiracy, War on the Waterfront. Look for Rewind on the ABC Listen app. This episode was produced by Sydney Peed and Sam Dunn. Audio production by Adair Shepherd. Our supervising producer is David Cody. I'm Sam Hawley. Thanks for listening.